Mr. Chairman, Jeffrey, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. It's a great pleasure to address such a distinguished group of parliamentarians and European specialists as are here today, and thank you for your attention this morning. I was asked to say something about the global challenges facing Europeans, and of course it's impossible only to talk about Europe if we're talking about the global challenges, but let me concentrate on the Europe and its neighbourhood. The fact is that that neighbourhood, of course, is interdependent with the rest of the world, and the strategic wheel is changing quickly. Wheels turn in strategy, and the strategic wheels are changing often for very many reasons that we never fully appreciate. And part of my job as a research director at a research institute is to try to put some perspective on the ways in which strategic wheels are turning. And so in the world economy, the strategic wheel is turning not so much because the world economy is changing its focus from Europe and the West to production and manufacturing in Asia, but because the world economy is much more driven by finance than ever before, and that makes it more volatile. That's the sort of perspective we think about. The strategic wheel in cyber issues is turning very fast. The world is 40% connected now in internet terms, and that figure will rise inexorably towards 60 or 80%. The strategic wheel is turning not because of the ubiquity of cyber, but because the center of gravity in the cyber world is moving from the North Atlantic to Asia, and that's something that is taking place as we see. And the strategic wheel of the United States is turning not because the United States has talked in terms of a reorientation to Asia, the so-called pivot to Asia, the pivot to the Pacific. That's not the real problem. The real problem is the strategic wheel is turning for the United States because it is exploring the limits of what political leadership can achieve in a much more volatile world. And so those contextual points all come together when we think about the particular problems of our neighborhood. And I wanted to say something more specifically about the Middle East and about our European region in terms of the defense and security problems. Let me begin by looking at the Middle East, partly in relation to what I've just said about broader strategic trends. The thing that's interesting about the Middle East is how little strategic change there has been in that region throughout the 20th century. The shape of the Middle East was essentially established at the end of the First World War, and it changed very little, despite the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, despite the Cold War, despite Al-Qaeda. It changed very little in that period, until the 17th of December, 2010, when a market seller in Tunisia, Bouazizi, set fire to himself in protest at the bureaucracy that was stopping him selling his vegetables and his fruit. And through social media, that went across the region and provoked the Arab Spring, as we now call it. And within weeks, there was a revolution in Tunisia. Within months, there was a revolution in Egypt. There was an uprising in Bahrain. There was a war in Yemen, a war in Libya, a war in Syria, and constant instability around the Gulf and insecurity created by that. And this phenomenon is a very quick turning of the wheel, the strategic wheel. We're now seeing real strategic change in the Middle East from literally the beginning of 2011. And that strategic change had nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli dispute, nothing to do with the Cold War, nothing to do with the great powers, and nothing to do with Al-Qaeda at the time. It was driven internally by forces we could talk about. Now, given that strategic wheel has turned, it is not surprising that all of the other factors I've mentioned now become relevant. Of course, it is not surprising that political Islam is on the rise in this situation, because as we all know, in revolutions are started by the moderates who are then swept away by the extremists, because extremists stand for something. They have an agenda. They know how to manipulate the situation. So it's not surprising that political Islam is as dominant in different parts of the region as we now see, because they benefit from the chaos. It's not surprising that the great powers should now be struggling to define their policies towards the region. And it's not surprising that the great powers within the region, Saudi Arabia and Iran, are now far more conflicted with each other and about the way in which they relate to the region. And so what we're seeing in the Middle East is, first of all, several layers of conflict. First of all, an intensive struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Second, and that's a great power struggle that would exist in any case, but has been exacerbated in the last 2 or 3 years, and that will continue. Secondly, we also see a deep religious element in all of that. And to put it simply, the sheer leadership of Iran with the sheer majority in Iraq, the sheer minority in Syria, and the 50% Shia in Lebanon, as opposed to the Sunni leadership in Saudi Arabia, the Sunni minority in Iraq, the Sunni majority in Syria, and the Sunni 50% and related groups in Lebanon. Add that to the Shia Sunni divisions around the Gulf, and you can see that there is a deep religious element to all of this. And the question for analysts is what we are seeing a conflict defined by religion, or is it about religion? And there's a big difference. I mean, in Britain, in Northern Ireland, in the Northern Ireland Troubles, we had a conflict that was defined by religion, but it wasn't about religion. Protestants and Catholics were not trying to destroy each other's religions. They were competing on a tribal basis that was defined by their religion. So there's a big difference between conflicts that are defined by a religious division and conflicts that are intrinsically about a religious division. And we do not know what the answer to that question is. But it matters, it really matters, how we answer that question analytically. Because if this is a conflict about religion, then it is possible that what we are now seeing across the Middle East is not just the fragmentation created by the Arab Spring, but perhaps we are seeing the beginning of the third millennial struggle between Shia and Sunni within Islam. Now, I'm not saying that this is happening, but it's a possibility. Is it possible that the first millennial struggle was in the 7th century AD? The second millennial struggle was in the 13th, 14th century. Is it possible that the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which is quite a long time ago now, will go down in history as the beginning of the third millennial struggle within the world of Islam? If that is the case, then our policy prescriptions for reacting to it will be very different than if we think that the issue in the Middle East is actually the fragmentation caused by successive revolutions. And that's a big, big issue for Western policymakers. My final point on the Middle East is looking at the effects of the Arab Spring. What is the next stage? And I think it's fairly clear, with all of our attempts to mediate, with all of our attempts to engage in a positive way in the Middle East, what we are looking at throughout the region is balkanization. And what that means, balkanization, is that some states will, of course, continue to exist, probably with weaker instruments of power. There will be some states arising that will claim recognition. And so we are already seeing probably the demise of 2 states in the Middle East, Iraq and Syria. And we are already seeing the rise of a new Kurdistan and IS, the Islamic State, which is not a state, but it will be a phenomenon that will probably exist for some time. And we may be seeing the possibility of the collapse of Lebanon and possibly the collapse of Jordan. If the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, if the Hashemite family ever fell in Jordan, then almost overnight, Jordan will be a radical Islamist state. Those are big, big changes. So we're seeing that sort of balkanization among the states. But that also means that we will see some proto-states claiming recognition, and there will be some areas of contested statehood and some areas of sheer ungoverned conflict. That's what balkanization means. So instead of a system in which there are defined states understood in 20th century terms, there will be a system of states, recognized, some semi-recognized states, some contested states, and some contested territories. That will be very messy. Then let me move to Europe. In a sense, what's happened in Europe? Just as the the Arab Spring was developing, so the European crisis, the economic crisis, was becoming important. The economic crisis begins in 2008. It begins in two dimensions. One is the war between Russia and Georgia in 2008, which tells us that we have a different Russian problem to deal with in Europe. And something else happens in 2008, which is the financial crisis. And by 2010, the financial crisis had become very political, which is to say it was beginning to affect the real economies of Europe, particularly of southern European states. And to put it in gross terms, what we are seeing is both a new East-West dimension to European security and a new North-South dimension. The East-West dimension is the fact that we have on our borders now a revisionist Russia, which is structurally revisionist. I won't go into that anymore, but happy to talk about it in questions if you want. But the revisionism we see in Russia will be with us for a long time. This is not a passing phase, and we could talk about that. And so that actually changes or adjusts our perception of the East-West relationship. More difficult to grasp, really, is the North-South relationship. With the economic crisis by 2010 had created a bigger division between Northern and Southern Europe than we had seen at any time since the foundation of the European Union. And that difference of perception between Northern European states and Southern European states is profoundly important in the difference in the way they now look at European security. So North European states have a different view of the refugee crisis to Southern European states, for obvious reasons. And Southern European states look differently at the Russian challenge to the Baltics or the Scandinavian countries, again, for reasons that we can understand. And so this North-South and this East-West dimension hits us in Europe, I think, in a number of ways. And Europe is suffering or is facing 5 simultaneous security crises. Let me outline what those 5 crises are. Let me just give you the headlines of each one. The first crisis is a crisis of global economic slowdown, because that prolongs the European recession. Remember that the recession that began in Europe from the economic crisis of 2008 has been the longest recession in European economic history. And the political effects of that are still being felt in ways that you will all be very well aware of. The political effects in extremist parties, both of left and right in Europe, of the lack of voting power for centrist parties. The mainstream parties are soaking up only 60% of the popular vote now instead of the 80% they soaked up 20 years ago. The clown candidates all over Europe, Beppe Grillo in Italy, Russell Brand in Britain, or Nigel Farage in Britain. I mean, there's different people you could look at. But there are candidates who represent people who would not have been taken seriously 20 or 30 years ago. Now they're taken pretty seriously, and they can campaign from their bedrooms. They campaign in cyberspace. So the global economic slowdown has created political effects in Europe which make European leadership harder. A second crisis is the crisis of a revisionist Russia that I've just referred to, and the effect that has on Eastern and Northeastern Europe. A third crisis is the looming problem of Grexit and Brexit, Greek exit from the euro, and British exit from the EU. Either of those things will be disastrous for the Union. Greek exit because it would weaken the euro tremendously and cause a ripple effect crisis throughout the European Union. And, as we say, don't get me started on British exit from the European Union, except to say that it would be, let me say here, that it would be a disaster for the United Kingdom because whatever view you take of the European Union from London, we are now in a position where British exit from the EU in 2017, if that's the way the referendum goes, would almost certainly create a vote on Scottish independence, which would likely be won in favour of independence. So an exit from the European Union would almost certainly trigger the breakup of the United Kingdom, which would create a constitutional crisis for Britain for the next 10 years. And Britain would take itself out of world politics. The rest of the world would simply regard Britain as having committed political suicide between 2017 and 2020. And it will be sometime the other side of 2030 or 2035 before Britain was taken seriously again as an actor in world politics. So Grexit and Brexit are crises which are bad for the EU and bad, in our case, for Britain. That's the third major set of crises that Europe is facing. The fourth, of course, is refugees. And the refugee crisis is characterized by what I would call push factors, pull factors, and Velcro factors. The numbers are not the issue. Remember that during the Balkan crises of the 1990s, there were 600,000 or 700,000 people a year moving away from the Balkans to other parts of Europe. 80% of those people went back once the Balkans had stabilized a little bit. So the numbers are not a particular issue. Remember, the United States admits 1 million people a year legally as migrants to the United States. There are pull factors in Europe because of the need for labor and skills. And of course, there are push factors because Europe is surrounded by a very destabilized and insecure neighborhood. And there are also what I call Velcro factors. Once large numbers of people begin to move in an uncontrolled way, they carry other people with them. And so a number of individual young unemployed men in southeastern Europe have thrown away their papers and claim to be Syrian refugees. It drags other people along. It drags serious organized crime with it. It drags a certain amount of terrorism with it. When people start to move, there's a Velcro effect that pulls other problems with it. So where you get the movement of peoples, you get serious organized crime. With serious organized crime goes opportunities for terrorism and goes the political effects of all of that. Those are big issues. Pull factors, push factors, and Velcro factors. And finally, the final crisis of the 5 crises that Europe is facing. In a sense, I would call it the Volkswagen Crisis. The Volkswagen Crisis is not just a crisis for Volkswagen. The whole of the automotive industry is doing this in different ways. This doesn't just affect Volkswagen. The automotive industry is due for a nervous breakdown in the way the banking industry was a few years ago, from which it is still recovering. And the reason that the Volkswagen crisis matters is because it adds to the problems of German leadership. Mrs. Merkel herself is under enormous pressure because of a series of crises, not least the refugee crisis, but also Volkswagen. And we see a Europe in which German leadership is harder to assert. French partnership with Germany is weaker than it's been for a long time, notwithstanding the Paris attacks. And British leadership is more marginalized for political reasons in the United Kingdom. The British Prime Minister is not trying to play the sort of role that other Prime Ministers have played. And those 3, Germany, France, Britain, those 3 locus of leaderships in Europe has not been there. And when we look at the good times in European integration and European security, it is normally because those 3 leaderships, and sometimes with Italian leadership as well, but those 3 particular leaderships are assertive, they agree with each other, and they have a common vision of the future. That simply isn't the case at the moment, and we're seeing weak leadership for reasons that we, I think, all understand. And so that leaves us with a dangerous neighborhood. We used to assume, whatever we looked at in the world, that Europe was essentially safe, essentially prosperous. The events of the last 5 years, since 2010, have shown us that Europe is not essentially safe, it is not universally prosperous, and it is surrounded by a neighborhood in the Middle East, let alone in Central Asia, which is more volatile than ever before. And as a research director at an institute in London, the point I would always make is that unless we analyze these issues properly, then we cannot begin to form policy responses to them with any degree of confidence. We have to analyze them properly. Thank you very much.